Mr. President, I rise to address the recent announcement from President Biden that he intends to nominate Saule Omarova to be comptroller of the currency. Now, Ms. Omarova, if she were in fact confirmed to be comptroller of the currency, she'd head up the agencies that is responsible for chartering and regulating national financial institutions. So that is to say, she would be the head of the primary regulator for America's national banks, of which there are very many. I just want to provide this morning a brief introduction, a glimpse into the mindset of this nominee. I will take more time on future occasions to delve more deeply into some of the things that she has advocated for and written about, and that I find extraordinarily disturbing. I think many of my colleagues will as well. But let me start with just a few observations. First, just little doubt, Ms. Omarova has been celebrated on the far left for promoting ideas that she herself has described as, quote, radical. That's a point we can agree on. These are very, very radical ideas. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a more radical choice for any regulatory spot in our federal government. I know that is a very sweeping statement to make. I think I can stand by it. So there's a lot that's extraordinary and radical here, but maybe the heart of it is Ms. Omarova doesn't just want to tighten regulation of banks. That's not what she's advocated for. What she wants to do, and I quote, this is her words, effectively end banking as we know it, end quote. Those are words she wrote just last year. This is not ancient history. These are the views she has articulated in writing within a year. She clearly has an aversion to anything like free market capitalism, and that's in her writing. In an October 2020 paper called, quote, The People's Ledger, end quote, she outlined a plan for, and I quote, radically reshaping the basic architecture and dynamics of modern finance, end quote. And what this was all about, what she was arguing for in this paper from just last year, was really promoting the nationalization of an entire industry, retail banking. Basically, bring to an end the ability of banks to compete for customers' services and instead nationalize that. A clear socialist idea that we shouldn't have free enterprise system competing for people's business, but rather have the government own it and provide that. Specifically, she wants the Federal Reserve to allocate credit and capital. And as part of this regime, she advocates that the government, acting through the Fed, would actually cut off credit to those deemed, quote, socially suboptimal, end quote. Can you imagine? Is there something more chilling than the idea that we would abolish retail banking, make it the responsibility of the Fed, and then actively require that the Fed decides who is socially optimal and who's not, and then allocate credit accordingly? This is unbelievable. In a 2012 paper, she suggested that a mandate that financial products could only be sold if they're approved in advance by the federal government. There's no freedom to innovate here. There's no responding to customers' wants and needs. There's no competition for providing a better, none of that. The government will decide what can and cannot be offered. Even she admitted that this is, quote, paternalistic and has command and control elements, end quote. At least she acknowledges that's what this is. But it doesn't end there. Ms. Omarova doesn't just want to nationalize banking. She wants to do that, but that's not all. She also wants the banking regulators to run the whole economy. Under her plan, which she, again, laid this out in writing, this is in a 2016 paper, the Federal Reserve would set prices in large sectors of the U.S. economy, those that she deems to be, quote, systemically important prices, end quote. That would include, she helpfully tells us, what would be considered systemically important prices, and I quote, widely used fuels, foodstuffs, some other raw materials, and wages or salary indices, among others. So she's openly advocating that the federal government sets wages and prices throughout the economy. Does this sound anything like a free enterprise economy? It's unbelievable. In addition to that, citing a desire to, quote, sidestep debilitating political battles over the federal budget, end quote. Now, just think about that term. Let's unpack that just a bit. Debilitating political battles over the federal budget. That sounds to me like Congress arguing over spending. Arguably the most fundamental responsibility of Congress. But in order to sidestep that fundamentally democratic process that follows our Constitution, in a 2020 white paper, Omarova proposed creating a national investment authority to channel both public and private capital to further policies that would be set by an unelected, unaccountable board. So the American people don't get to decide how their tax dollars get allocated by holding members of Congress accountable through elections. Instead, there'd be some board that would make all these decisions for us. And that's not the only unaccountable body she's proposed to exert control over the private sector. In a 2012 paper, Ms. Omarova also proposed creating a public interest council. A public interest council. And their purpose would be to use pressure and propaganda tactics to manipulate public opinion against banks and regulators and to, quote, generate mass political support for the actions it considers necessary, end quote, and, quote, build its independent power base. I'm almost speechless. It's absolutely extraordinary. So you could ask yourself, where would a person even come up with these ideas? How does it even happen that it occurs to someone to think up these things? Well, maybe a contributing factor could be if a person grew up in the former Soviet Union and went to Moscow State University and attended there on a Vladimir Lenin academic scholarship. Now, let me be very, very clear about something. There are lots of wonderful American citizens who were born and raised behind the Iron Curtain. I totally get that, including in the former Soviet Union, who've come to this country and they love America as much as anyone I've ever met. I know some of them personally. So I'm not suggesting in any way that growing up behind the Iron Curtain and attending university in Moscow is in any way disqualifying. But the attitude a person has about the Soviet regime, now that's another matter. So in the case of Ms. Omarova, in 2019, she tweeted, and I quote, "Say what you will about the old USSR, there was no gender pay gap there. Markets don't always know best," end quote. Say what you will about the old USSR. Really, there's a lot to say. I'll have a lot to say on another occasion about the old USSR. She followed up with the tweet. She decided to clarify that, and here's the tweet she issued afterwards. She said, and I quote, "I never claimed women and men were treated absolutely equally in every facet of Soviet life, but people's salaries were set by the state in a gender-blind manner, and all women got very generous maternity benefits. Those things are still a pipe dream in our society." Can you imagine? Ms. Omarova clearly knows her views are far outside of the mainstream. How do we know? Well, why else would her most recent resume have been scrubbed of one particular item that was on her resume as recently as 2017? And that item is the thesis that she wrote when she was a student in Moscow on her Vladimir Lenin Personal Academic Scholarship. The title we know, the title of the thesis was, and I quote, "Karl Marx's Economic Analysis and the Theory of Revolution in the Capital," end quote. Unfortunately, that's all I know about this thesis. Now, this morning I released a letter that I sent to Ms. Omarova, requesting that she provide a copy of this paper in the original Russian to the committee in time for us to translate it so that we can fully consider her nomination. Like most committees, the Banking Committee requires nominees provide copies of any articles or papers they've written, and that is a very important tool that we use to evaluate a person's thoughts and fitness and temperament and judgment and where they're coming from. I'm looking forward to receiving that paper from hers. I will conclude with this, Mr. President. You know, in a country as big as ours, where we have 330-some million people, I have no doubt that there are some individuals that we can find here and there who would think of the Soviet Union, that brutal, oppressive, totalitarian, freedom-suppressing, soul-sucking, murderous regime that was the Soviet Union. There must be some people somewhere in America who somehow would compare it favorably to the United States, as shocking as that is. What's never occurred to me is that a person who thinks that way could possibly be considered to an important, powerful, and prominent position in the federal government. I yield the floor.